Welcome students to lecture 19 of MHHS 1. We're now engaging with our final text of the course, and I think it's really appropriate since it's one that is oriented toward future and possible notions of healthful embodiment. Sage Nigel Whitson is part of UCR's Department of Dance and a wonderful artist and teacher whom I got to know briefly from being on a PhD dissertation committee with them. They are a queer, non-binary, transdisciplinary artist whose recent work on the unarrival experiments examines the aesthetic possibilities of the astrophysical discoveries or unconcealments of dark matter and dark energy. So these are terms that we'll unpack in the next lecture, but for now, I just want to introduce this body of work as perhaps answering the MHHS call to action that I think's been building throughout our readings in this course. So we heard this as recently as the last two lectures with Chikako Takeshida's reflexive embodied scholarship, simultaneously savagely critiquing the IUD's exploitative constructions of ideal or valuable women and embodying that very same construction of the IUD user. So we have a strong sense now, I hope, that all these humanities disciplines that we've surveyed through this course, all these humanities disciplines that we've talked about, offer incredibly cogent and powerful critiques of medical institutions that knowingly or unknowingly cause harm or deepen health inequities. But as Takeshida's article explains, there is a kind of situatedness or a kind of complicity with our critiques, since we must live ourselves in these systems of harm and inequity. What we need then is to tap into radical and transformative imaginations and creativities to think ourselves out of these systems, even when it might seem like an impossibility. The piece you've read for today will sound strange, and that's part of the point. Speaking and creating outside the normative boundaries of knowledge, making must be strange if it wants to enact this MHHS critique. First, I want to situate this strange piece called Superfluid, Super Black, Translations and Teachings in Transembodied Metaphysics. This text was originally delivered as a keynote lecture for the 2020 Collegium for African Diaspora Dance Conference, Fluid Black, Dance Back at Duke University. So I've linked here to a video of some conference highlights. And those 20 minutes are well worth viewing in its entirety, but you can see the relevant snippet from Whitson's talk from time codes 551 to 703. So I've situated it here within its original context, the conference context, because I want you to think about how the text changes when presented this way and in the conference context. Presumably, you've read it just as words on a page. Whitson describes it, however, as a hybrid text. What changes when you hear them deliver it at a conference in that video? Did you laugh at all the same places as the audience of that conference did? What was the affective texture of that laughter? How did the spoken delivery create a different context? These are all emergent questions that this textual hybridity, I think, invites. From this conference poster here, we can learn that there are three organizing questions for the February 21st to 23rd, 2020 meeting. Quote, in what ways does Black dance engender mobility on and off the dance floor or concert stage? How does Black dance render Blackness visible in the absence of Black bodies? How does race, gender, class, and sexuality inform African diaspora dance communities? So those are the three questions from the conference. And the text that you read for today was delivered as a keynote address to that conference. How do you think, and this is a question for you now, how do you think Whitson addressed these questions? Did they complicate these questions? Did they invite even more beyond these three questions that the conference organizers imagined? So I'm claiming, in another kind of context kind of issue, I'm claiming that the date of this conference is also significant because late February in 2020 was also just about when the United States first started taking the COVID-19 pandemic seriously. In fact, there was probably some serious discussion among the conference organizers about if they should cancel the meeting or still hold it in person. So about this same time, as I mentioned before in one of the previous lectures, I was on a year-long fellowship at the Huntington Library in San Marino. In late February, we were already getting a little bit antsy about how we could continue our archival research and maintain our scholarly community. Now, our timeline was a little bit different. We were finally kicked out of our offices because of the pandemic in mid-March 2020, just a few weeks after this in-person conference at Duke. So I want to suggest here that this is also a significant context for how we should read this hybrid text. How does Whitson's text read now in retrospect after the pandemic? Do those organizing questions about mobility and visibility take on a medicalized valence of healthful moving through the world and seeing it for what it is? Does the seemingly generous list of identity categories of race, gender, class, and sexuality now seem to exclude newly spotlighted categories of illness, disease, debility, and disability? Whitson's hybrid text works very differently, I think, in different contexts. Whereas in the celebratory, joyful context of the conference, the text seems to emphasize virtuosic movement and liberatory visibility. In the elegiac context of a worldwide pandemic, however, the text seems to teach us more about dystopian futures that have yet to be redeemed. So about a year later, this text was published as a chapter in an edited collection called Critical Black Futures, Speculative Theories, and Explorations. Another shifting context for this hybrid text. This book was meant to further the speculative work of what is now known as Afrofuturism. The description of the book's task is to bring, quote, together leading scholars to critique current futuristic landscapes and speculatively imagine the future from various Black perspectives. In Philip Black's introduction, he sees this as an extension of the decades-long scholarly and artistic explorations of Afrofuturism. The hope is to, as Black puts it, quote, to name the way that Black art, literature, style, and existence speak to the realities and counter societal normativities. So the popular example of Afrofuturism that you may be familiar with is the Black Panther Marvel franchise. In those films, you can see how Afrofuturist art speaks to the present from the future and challenges our aesthetic, social, and political normativities. So I put all these kind of contextual agendas together for this hybrid text. A dance conference at Duke, a global pandemic, and the academic discussion of Afrofuturist aesthetics, because I think it shows us the complicated contextual push and pull of medicine's sexist, racist, and ableist legacy, and its hopeful projections into a transformed future of new, healthful embodiments. So this lecture will focus on the terrible histories evoked by Whitson's text, and the next lecture will highlight Whitson's counterbalancing hope for what they call a, quote, transembodied metaphysics. One shameful episode of the history of medicine that Whitson brings up in the text is the disproportionate impact of the HIV/AIDS epidemic on Black gay men in the 1980s. After Whitson's evocative and serpentine lines on repair and healing, they tell a more grounded story of writing these lines after a, quote, house sermon led by performance artist, writer, and ordained minister Marvin K. White. Through a really vivid ceremony of creating footsteps in baby powder, They were meant to paint, quote, lives back alive, and to summon the ghosts of those who had disappeared because of the homophobic and racist public health response to HIV/AIDS in the 1980s. So I don't have a whole lot of time to get into the history of HIV/AIDS in the 1980s, but it's something that you can look up yourselves. Referencing this history becomes important to Whitson because, as they put it, we have to summon back these historical lives, quote, lest we let ourselves disappear. Whitson's previous project, called A Meditation on Tongues, and this was in 2017, was a reimagining of a critically important documentary film from the 1980s, Marlon T. Riggs's Tongues United, 1989. So I've linked here to a short video of Whitson talking about how and why they are revisiting this documentary film. And I've also linked to a trailer for the 1989 experimental documentary. So I just want you to watch both of these together. Watching both video clips, you'll hear the echo of Riggs's 1989 brother-to-brother mantra in Whitson's 2017 dance performance. Riggs's documentary is also a kind of hybrid text. It blends documentary footage, poetry, and music to explore the theme of silence around the real experiences of Black gay men. You might recognize this famous 1987 poster that is supposed to have represented the gay community in the 80s. Quote, "Silence is death." Silence is death, they proclaimed, because the political silence about the AIDS crisis meant that the LGBTQ plus community would become an invisible population, undeserving of care from a government that was supposed to protect its citizens. Riggs's documentary also takes on this theme of silence, but at the even more precarious intersection of race and sexuality. In a particularly moving vignette, Riggs tells the story of how he himself coped with the AIDS-related deaths of his own friends. The documentary shows throughout the intensified silences around Black gay existence in the 1980s. Now, in 2017, in A Meditation on Tongues, Whitson honors this path-breaking documentary from 1989 and updates these silences to include Black, trans, and gender nonconforming embodiment. In the clip that you can see here, you might recognize Slim Ninja as the character Lamar from the FX series Pose. As Whitson explains, his presence in A Meditation on Tongues is a kind of remembrance. His voguing dance and movement is meant to honor the legacy of the ball or house culture of the 1980s. The piece that we read for today begins thinking about future embodiments then by reflecting on the still persistent silences of the past. At the end of their introduction, Whitson reiterates the kind of operating mode of the hybrid text. Quote, "So I say again, I've been dreaming in music and seeing in the dark." So just in those three lines, there's an evocation of a past of deathly silence and the dehumanizing invisibility of the dark. But as Whitson reflects upon and reckons with that silence and darkness, they begin to construct music, dance, and possibility. The text also moves into the more distant past as well. In the search for these future embodiments beyond the restrictive prescriptions of normative health, Whitson also steps back centuries to the horrible history of the transatlantic slave trade. In theorizing this kind of fluid liquidity of embodiment, they come up against a stumbling block that requires just a little bit more historical reflection. And this is a quote from the hybrid text. Quote, "In preparation for this keynote, I was thinking about Black diasporic traditions, liquid or liquidity, where we have met each other, and the far too plentiful experiences of boulders and rough edges. I searched for another proposal." So Gender non-conforming fluidity makes perfect sense. But liquidity, however, evokes, quote, boulders and rough edges in the treacherous transatlantic water. When the next proposal that Whitson talks about comes, this history starts to come into view. Quote, something fluid, but not liquid. A blackness with flow, yet free from water scenarios that position our conditions with drownings, murderous submerges, or the ocean nightmare of our way to diaspora. The flow that honors transformation, the fluidity of the ocean floor shape-shifting to galactic space, where blackness births things. So in this passage, I'm claiming perhaps Whitson had in mind this famous image of the Zong, an infamous slaver ship from 1781. Now, as was the practice at the time, the slaver syndicate had insured themselves against the loss of their human cargo. Because of inclement weather and navigational difficulties, the crew finally decided that they didn't have enough water to make the trip. But instead of rationing the water to everyone, the crew decided to throw all the enslaved people overboard, drowning them so that they could survive. So just think for a bit how many times we've heard this moral calculus so far in this course, and it's a lot. And the moral calculus is about sacrificing lives considered less valuable for the sake of the healthy, for the sake of the worthy. Later, the owners of the slave ship filed an insurance claim and convinced a court of law that throwing 130 enslaved people overboard was legally justified. Now, because of writers like Olada Equiano, a formerly enslaved African turned freedman in London, the Zong massacre became a flashpoint in the history of abolition. These are liquids, what Whitson calls water scenarios. And Whitson wants to overcome them with fluidity, a transformation of these murderous drownings into, quote, galactic space, instead of a history that silences blackness with murder and with violence. Whitson finds in the larger galactic space somewhere where blackness actually births things. So this is the counter-normative fluidity that Whitson wants to highlight. In Black, transgender, and gender nonconforming embodiments, Whitson is in conversation with a kind of hopeful possibility about futurity. By synthesizing many African diasporic traditions beyond the tragic past of the HIV/AIDS crisis and the shameful history of the transatlantic slave trade, Whitson can celebrate the dances and movements of Black spiritualities and of Black performances. After acknowledging the earthly scale of historical racisms, homophobias, and transphobias, Whitson expands to the grandest scale possible to envision that kind of titular, superfluid, and super Black future. The invisibilities and silences of gay men in the 1980s and the continuing invisibilities and silences of gender nonconforming folk in the 21st century are really poignantly reconceptualized as a powerful darkness that binds the universe at a galactic scale. Whereas public health initiatives of the 1980s and contemporary health inequities only offer very restrictive and policed categories of healthful embodiment, Whitson is trying to offer us stranger, more creative, and more imaginative strategies to imagine new collectivities, new forms of human flourishing, new dances, new activisms, new embodiments, and new movements.